So we're closing out year 1 of Destiny pretty soon. New subclasses are coming, and so I thought it would be cool to do a retrospective on all the subclasses, talk about their strengths and weaknesses from year 1, and maybe discuss what changes I'd like to see to them in year 2. We'll oddly enough start with the Hunter. The Hunter has pretty definitively been a PvP powerhouse and a PvE non-factor in year 1. Arguably the best PvP class in the game, they are the only class where the global kill-death ratio in PvP is above 1.0 for both subclasses, although this could be due to multiple factors beyond the obvious. They do have the highest kill-death ratios among the subclasses as well, with Gunslinger and Blade Dancer having a 1.2 KD, while Titans struggle to break 1.1. Kill-death ratios are not indicative of skill, but for such a large population, it's a decent start. They are the highest represented class in the game in class breakdown, top 100 class breakdown in PvP, and top 10,000 in PvP as well. They have the highest super kills in PvP among the subclasses, as well as 2 of the top 3 grenade total kills across the entire population. Their subclass population is a perfect 50-50 split as of the writing of this video, and that's because both subclasses are very strong in PvP, with both their very heavy focus on slaying, and with safety precautions like Hungering Blade and Golden Gun itself with something like Combustion. When I last discussed Hunters, I mentioned that Hunters had double the kills come from their super versus something like the Titan. Hunters I knew had around 17% of their total kills come from their super in PvP versus 9% for the Warlock and the Titan. While this is outdated information, I cannot imagine that it has changed that much. For example, I have about 35,000 PvP kills on my Titan, with only 3,300 of them coming from supers. A variable that could change this data is Trials of Osiris, where supers are not used as often and or do not get as many kills. However, the Hunter's strength in PvP does not translate well to PvE. In PvE, they are a forgettable class. They are a pretty selfish class, having essentially no team utility whatsoever. Their grenades are not better than either of the other classes. Their melee has some range with it with Throwing Knife and Blink Strike, which is nice, but melee attacks are generally not worth it, and the amount of time you need to commit to a throwing knife is probably not worth the time spent, even with a headshot. While the Gunslinger has the only perks in the game that can make you more efficient at using weaponry, that's really all it has going for it, with Blade Dancer having much less. Golden Gun's damage is pretty poor, it's barely able to take out one equal level major target, and Arcblade's damage is almost equally as bad versus major targets, if not worse. The one thing Arcblade is good at, which is taking out low tier enemies, results in some of the worst orb generation out of any super in the game. Not to mention that taking out low tier enemies is generally not something that's very difficult to do. In endgame PvE, the Hunter was a non-factor up until Prison of Elders due to the ability to resurrect and the 3-person nature of the encounters, whereas in the raids, resurrecting one person was typically not a big deal with 5 other players around. Blade Dancer became popular, but only because it enabled Hunters to travel quickly around the map, go invisible, and resurrect people, not to mention they made dismantling mines much easier. However, I can't imagine the intent of the Blade Dancer was to be a resurrection bot. Gunslinger had its moments in the Vault of Glass during the Atheon encounter with the ability to kill the 3 hobgoblins when you're teleported into the left side teleporter, and the ability to quickly get rid of the last set of supplicants, but those are very specific circumstances. Blade Dancer was essentially useless in Vault of Glass, maybe able to get you through the Gorgon maze a little bit easier, but that was about it. In Crota's End, Blade Dancer became viable due to the mass amount of thrall in encounters, but it was never something that you felt like you needed to have, which is good and not good. It's good because you're not forced to bring a Blade Dancer, but it's bad because you don't feel as important. Blade Dancers also gained some fame for being able to use the sword very efficiently versus Crota thanks to their ability to go invisible, but this was never a requirement to complete the encounter. The Taken King appears to fix a lot of Hunter's PvE woes by adding in the Nightstalker subclass, which is very much a support-based playmaker subclass in PvE. However, as much as I'm looking forward to playing Nightstalker, I'd definitely like to see some tweaks to the current subclasses as to not render them completely dead for PvE purposes, as well as some tweaks to tone down their PvP strength just a little bit. For Gunslinger, I'd like to see Golden Gun do more damage and actually be the thing that Bungie said it should be, the thing that you activate when you absolutely 100% need some things dead. Right now, it's the thing that you use when you need something absolutely 87% dead, and then another thing like 39% dead. I'd like to see increased damage for Golden Gun across the board, and then maybe a buff to Golden Gun's damage when you shoot something that's already been hit by Golden Gun. Meaning if you want to spread the damage, that's fine, but if you're fighting a boss or something, you get a nice little damage bonus to make it feel like it has a little more oomph to it. A lot of people have expressed their desire for Golden Gun to be able to critically hit targets, and I think that would be alright. We'll talk about this soon. For Blade Dancer, I'd also like to see a buff to its damage, possibly done in the same way, where repeated hits against the same enemy increase the damage you do per swing, and repeated hits against the same enemy take up slightly less energy per swing, both up to a cap. We can do either one. It wouldn't make fighting majors seem so awful or useless, while still keeping that slaying potential of low tier enemies the same. I wouldn't mind seeing the orb generation be cranked up either, but if they're worried about people being able to generate too many orbs, just cap Blade Dancer at 6 orbs per super instead of 8 like everyone else, or instead of 4 like they are now. If they want Blade Dancer to be this insane murder machine, they need to make it so I don't feel like I'm just tickling major targets. Not all of the subclasses need to have support capabilities. We don't need to make the Gunslinger or the Blade Dancer into these Nightstalker Defender type subclasses where they need to have all this utility to be useful. But if we're going to have these Slayer DPS style subclasses, make sure that they can bring the damage and bring it in a big way. We'll talk more about the Voidwalker and the Striker in upcoming videos, but that's partially why you don't see those subclasses as much either. If changes aren't made to the 2 subclasses we have now, you're pretty much exclusively going to see Nightstalker dominate the PvE scene. In PvP, I think the Gunslinger is mostly fine. My only issue is with Golden Gun itself and its very forgiving timer, but also with something like Acleophage Symbiote. 3 shots is fine for PvP, but the Symbiote giving a 4th just edges it a little too much over the power line. I think a decent balance to the Symbiote would be that if you wear the Symbiote, you get that 4th shot, but maybe a couple of seconds are shaved off your timer. In PvE, this wouldn't have a dramatic effect as you're generally popping your Golden Gun shots pretty quickly after activation, and in PvP, this would make Golden Gun feel a little more urgent, but for those with good timing or activations, this should not change a whole lot. However, other exotics could use a buff as well to not make the Symbiote basically the default option for PvP. Blade Dancers in PvP are definitely on the strong side as well. Being able to blink around contributes to the blink shotgun playstyle, which is something many people are not fans of. In the competitive scene and for high-level players, Arcblade is a slightly less challenging thing to deal with, but for the average player, Arcblade is very difficult to counter, especially having to fight against the Hungering Blade perk, which regenerates your shield and your health at the same time. Not only of that, but the maneuverability of Arcblade makes getting away or trying to fight very difficult. You're essentially at the mercy of the auto-targeting of the ability. Arcblade can send hunters up vertically into the air as long as they're somewhat within range of their target. On top of that, using Arcblade attacks to dash across the map takes very little energy per swing, allowing terrible activations to still get some kills. I wouldn't mind Arcblade taking up slightly more energy per swing that does not hit a target to tone down the longevity of the ability, and I wouldn't mind seeing Hungering Blade regenerate your health, then shield as opposed to both at the same time, or at the very least, slightly slow down the regeneration so that hunters can't just blitz into a group of 4 to 5 people and end up the victor without very good movement. However, with my suggestion, health regeneration would not stop if you take damage from a damage over time ability, but if you were shot, then it would stop. Blink is a problem in its own right, but it's something that I don't really have an answer to right now, so I'm not even going to try and touch it, other than something needs to be done about it. In fact, something is being done about Blink, we just don't know what it is yet. We also have the perk Quick Draw, which allows for incredibly fast weapon readiness. It's partly why Blink Shotgun with the Blade Dancer is so strong. It allows you to ready your weapon so much faster compared to a Voidwalker, to the point that once you even realize what's happening, you're probably already dead. However, I don't think this is a game-breaking perk. It's not at the point where it completely makes or breaks an experience, or makes Blade Dancer over the top, but it's still good enough that I think something should be done about it. It's also pretty much exclusively a PvP-centric bonus, and I think nerfing it would not affect the Blade Dancer's PvE capabilities at all. How it should be nerfed is definitely up for debate. So obviously the old subclasses need some work because the new ones are definitely more interesting and have cooler abilities. To have the old subclasses be able to contend with the new, they need to be redesigned in the same way that the new subclasses were originally designed. I have a few ideas here and there for some changes I'd like to see. So what needs to be taken a look at in the gunslinger tree? Well, all of their grenades are pretty balanced and have different utility, although I'd like to see the damage over time component of incendiary grenade to be buffed in PvE. Gunslinger jumps, I think, are fine. In the golden gun column, all of the bonuses are horrifically boring. Deadeye probably sees the least amount of use because it is not very difficult to land a shot with golden gun. It's pretty bad. It could use some kind of a buff, like, I don't know, golden gun is now capable of precision hits, which makes sense with the name at least, although it is still kind of a boring bonus. Combustion is alright, but I think it could use a little something extra, like repeated shots against the same target increase the damage of your next golden gun shot and causes enemies to explode. But the radius of the explosion would get bigger if more golden gun shots landed on that target and it died. I just don't know how to fit all that neatly into a text box. Gunfighter is good for PvE, but the problem is it's also kind of boring. It's just flat cooldown reduction. Giving it an Obsidian Mine style bonus where kills reduce the cooldown of the next one I think would be cool, to the point where killing one major would equal 3 minor targets. I think that would be a good start. I'm focusing a lot on buffing current nodes. I'm not creative enough to come up with completely new nodes. In the melee slot, Circle of Life is near useless and I don't think I've ever seen it used. I don't even think I've thrown a throwing knife while my golden gun was active, ever. Not to mention, you need to kill with it, not just hit. And not to mention that, but you only get extra time. Incendiary Blade is fine, although once again the PvE damage over time component could use a slight buff, and Knife Juggler works fine as a bonus. An interesting buff that I think could be given to Circle of Light, at least maybe for PvE purposes, would be to give you an additional golden gun shot if you kill with the throwing knife as opposed to just adding more time. In PvP this is pretty difficult to pull off, which is why I don't think it would affect the game too much, but in PvE it can potentially give you 2 extra shots if you spec for an additional throwing knife. Keep in mind that Knife Juggler is in the same tree, so there's no worry about infinite throwing knives. That suggestion might be a little bit on the strong side though, I don't know. Scavenger is a cool bonus and so is Keyhole, but Gunslinger's Trance is the PvE choice by far because it's so good. Grenades and melee just aren't good enough damage-wise and benefit-wise to compete with Gunslinger's Trance, and Keyhole is very situational for PvE purposes. I wouldn't mind seeing Scavenger getting some love, but I'm not really sure how to buff it. You could do something like picking up an ammo pack increases your damage for a few seconds, but that's kind of boring. You could do something like picking up an ammo pack provides 25% of that ammo to your fire team. I think that would be interesting, could give people some extra heavy ammo, although that could get out of hand. I think Keyhole is cool, but maybe to give it a slight buff, for every target you over-penetrate through, the shot deals more damage as it passes through more targets. So if you hit a target and it keeps going through, it deals extra damage. The only massive problem in the final column is Over the Horizon, which is basically never used and could use a nice buff. Maybe something along the lines of being farther away from your target increases the damage of Golden Gun along with the range buff. In PvP this would be a non-factor, and in PvE could be a nice boost to damage. That buff is honestly probably something that could go on an exotic as well, maybe something like the ATS-8 Arachnid. That would be a nice buff. Chains of Woe is easily the go-to in this column for PvE, and I'd love for something to be able to compete, or at the very least, give people a reason to swap back and forth between them depending on the encounter. Those are some of the changes I put forward to make the Gunslinger a little more trigger-happy. There's a lot of stuff in there to buff Golden Gun damage, and if they want Golden Gun to be this true murder machine, they need to make it a little bit better. Although now that I'm looking at my revised tree, I may have gone a little bit overboard, but I think there's a couple of good ideas in there. Blade Dancer does not have as many trouble spots as far as interesting bonuses, but the main problem is also its damage and the fact that it's pretty weak. Their grenades and jumps are fine. I think Skip Grenade could use a little something though. All of their super abilities right now are pretty cool, and I'm not really sure they need to be changed up that much. I just never really feel that powerful as a PvE Blade Dancer in terms of dealing damage. I just tickle things. A slight PvE damage buff would be nice. In the melee column, again, most things are at the very least interesting and play into the Blade Dancer style pretty well. Fast Twitch is boring, but it's alright. Now that I'm looking at the rest of the tree, all of the bonuses are interesting or play into the subclass pretty well. It's just that it doesn't really translate well to any sort of PvE strength. I know I don't want to see Blade Dancer's main appeal be the invisible resurrection bot. I'd love it to be a little bit more than that. I just don't know what I'd want it to be in PvE. The class works great for PvP, as we've learned. It doesn't seem like a utility or support class, it seems more like a I'm gonna zip around everywhere and kill everything class. I think something that could be interesting as an ability on Arcblade would be the concept of tagging multiple targets and having them linked together with some sort of chain lightning effect, where the more targets that are tagged, the more damage it does, and have that go baseline on the ability. However, that would mean that the current abilities would have to get changed around a bit. Showstopper could probably get switched to something else, but Razor's Edge and Vanish are crowd favorites. I don't know how well they would fit with the new ability though. Overall, the Hunter right now is in a dominant PvP spot and a not as great but slightly better than they used to be PvE spot, but that was really only because of the PvE endgame. They are a damage-focused Slayer class, and while they show huge promise with the Nightstalker subclass in PvE, I think having options is always going to be good, especially for a game like Destiny, which prides itself on not requiring any particular set of classes or subclasses to complete content. The Nightstalker subclass seeks to give that utility that other subclasses can bring in PvE, where having team utility matters much more. However, much like in MMOs, certain subclasses and specializations are built to be better than others for certain situations. It all depends on what direction Bungie wants to take it. I'll be back soon with a retrospective on the other two classes, along with maybe some other topics of discussion if I get to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.